The bullet cracked the frozen air a heartbeat before the sound of the gunshot reached the street. Sheriff Silas Granger didn't flinch. He was already moving his hand a blur as it drew the Colt from its holster, the familiar weight a cold comfort against the biting wind. From his position behind an overturned water trough, he saw them 3 men, their faces masked by bandanas, backing out of the First Territorial Bank of Frost Hollow. The snowstorm, which had been threatening all morning, was beginning to descend in earnest, the flakes thick and wet, already turning the red dust of the main street into a slick, frozen mud. 2 of the men carried heavy canvas bags, their movements clumsy and rushed. The third, however, moved with a chilling, unhurried grace. He was taller than the others, his duster whipping around his legs in the wind. He held a silver-plated Schofield revolver, its barrel still smoking. This was the leader. This was Jedediah Kane. "Hold your fire." Sheriff Kane's voice was a rich baritone, carrying easily over the rising howl of the wind. Wouldn't want any of these good people to catch a stray. He gestured with his revolver towards the bank's entrance, where the manager, Mr. Abernathy, and a young teller stood shivering, their hands raised high. Silas's jaw was a granite ridge. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, peering from behind parted curtains and the frosted glass of storefronts. They were afraid, and their fear was a weight on his shoulders, heavier than the snow crusting his hat brim. He had 2 deputies, both young, both pinned down on the far side of the street. It was his move. "Let the hostages go," Kane Silas called out, his voice a low growl. "You can have the money. Just walk away." Kane laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, Sheriff, if you think this is about money, you haven't been paying attention." As his men mounted their horses, their eyes darting nervously towards the sheriff's office, Kane took a step back into the bank. Silas tensed his finger, tightening on the trigger. What was he doing? Through the large front window, Silas saw Kane walk calmly to Mr. Abernathy's desk. He ignored the scattered papers and the open cash drawer. Instead, he picked up a small, velvet-lined box from the corner of the desk, a box Silas recognized with a jolt that went through him like ice water. He'd brought it here himself 2 months ago, and his pride scraped raw, his pockets empty. Kane opened the box. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, was a silver locket intricately carved with the image of a bluebird. Elena's locket, the one she'd worn every day, the one he'd held in his hand as she drew her last breath. He'd pawned it to pay for Lena's winter coat, telling himself it was just an object, that the memory was what mattered. He had been lying. Kane held the locket up, letting it catch the gray light filtering through the window. He looked directly at Silas, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, visible even beneath the bandana. It was a smile of intimate knowledge, of a shared, terrible history. Then he slipped the locket into his pocket. The rage that surged through Silas was blinding. It was a hot black poison that burned away all reason. He rose from behind the trough, his Colt steady in his hand, his sights leveled on Kane's chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. But Kane was already moving. He backed out of the bank, keeping the trembling form of Abernathy between himself and Silas's gun. He swung into his saddle with the same fluid grace, his horse a powerful black stallion that pawed impatiently at the frozen ground. "This is just the beginning," Granger Kane called his voice, a chilling promise. He reined his horse around, and the 3 outlaws spurred their mounts down the street, disappearing into the swirling curtain of white. Silas fired once, a shot of pure, helpless fury that splintered the sign of the livery stable far down the road. The hostages collapsed in relief. The deputies ran forward. The town began to buzz with panicked chatter. But Silas didn't hear any of it. He stood alone in the middle of the street, the snow melting on his face like cold tears at the image of that knowing smile, and the glint of his wife's stolen locket burned into his mind. The robbery wasn't random. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a reckoning, and it had just begun. The train whistle was a mournful cry, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. When Laura stepped from the carriage onto the platform, the promised tranquility of Frost Hollow, Colorado, was nowhere to be found. The town was a maelstrom of muted chaos. Men shouted from doorways, their words snatched away by the gale. A woman was sobbing into a handkerchief near the station house, her shoulders shaking. The air was thick, not just with snow, but with a palpable tension, a collective fear that clung to the buildings like frost. Laura clutched the handle of her small leather suitcase, her gloved fingers numb. The faded cream dress she wore, intended for a quiet wedding, to a man she'd never met, felt foolishly thin against the onslaught of the cold and the town's palpable distress. She pulled her pale scarf tighter around her neck and scanned the street, searching for the face of Thomas Langston, the man whose letters had spoken of a gentle life, of shared warmth against the mountain chill. No one was looking for her. The townspeople's glances were nervous and inward, their attention fixed on the far end of the street, where a small crowd had gathered outside the bank. She saw the gallows frame first, a stark skeletal silhouette against the churning gray sky. The whine of the wind through its timbers sounded like a lament. The red dust of the high country was frozen into the ruts of the main street, a grim reminder of the blood-red earth that lay just beneath the pristine white snow. This was not the haven she had pictured. This was a place on edge, a place holding its breath. A horse and rider emerged from the blizzard, moving with a slow, heavy deliberation that commanded the chaos to part. The man was a figure carved from the winter itself. A thick, frost-covered coat concealed his frame, and a low-brimmed hat shadowed his face. But the sheer force of his presence was unmistakable. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his boots thudding on the wooden boardwalk. The crowd quieted their gazes, a mixture of fear and expectation. This was the law. The station master, a harried man with spectacles fogged by the cold, hurried over to him, pointing a trembling finger in Laura's direction. "Sheriff, this one just got off the train. Says she's here to meet a man." The sheriff turned and his gaze found her. It wasn't a glance. It was an impact. His eyes were the color of a winter sky before a storm, and they held the raw, unvarnished look of a man fresh from violence. His face was grim, a mask of fury and failure. A fresh scratch ran along his jawline, and his knuckles were scraped raw. He was not the stoic peacekeeper she might have imagined, but a man simmering on the brink of an explosion. He strode toward her, his steps heavy and certain. Laura felt a tremor of instinctual fear, the kind a rabbit feels when a hawk's shadow passes over it. She straightened her spine, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. "Name of the man you came to marry." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that expected no argument and offered no comfort. "Thomas Langston," she managed to say, her own voice a thin whisper against the wind. Sheriff Silas Granger stopped directly in front of her. The cold air between them seemed to crackle. He didn't blink, didn't soften his gaze. "There is no Thomas Langston in Frost Hollow." The words were flat final. They struck her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the last fragile remnants of hope from her lungs. The promises in the letters, the careful descriptions of a life she had dared to dream of, all of it dissolved into the swirling snow. She was a fool stranded at the edge of the world, in the middle of a crisis she couldn't comprehend, standing before a man who looked as broken and dangerous as the land itself. "No Thomas Langston." Silas repeated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. He turned on his heel, gesturing for her to follow him into the cramped station office. "Gus, pull the town registry." The station master, Gus, a wiry old man with a perpetually worried expression, scurried behind his desk. The office was an oasis of meager warmth, the pot-bellied stove in the corner glowing a dull red. Laura stood hesitantly by the door, her suitcase feeling impossibly heavy. She could feel the sheriff's impatience, like a physical force, in the small room. He paced the floorboards, his movements restless, and caged his mind clearly 1,000 miles away, back on that snow-swept street. "Here it is," Sheriff Gus said, running a gnarled finger down a long leather-bound book. "No Langston. Not a single one. We got a Larrabee who runs the smithy and old man Langer, who died of consumption 2 winters back, but no Langston." Gus peered at Laura over his spectacles. "Were the letters postmarked from here, miss?" Laura nodded numbly, reaching into her reticule. Her fingers still trembling, fumbled with the clasp before she pulled out the small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. She handed them to the sheriff. Silas took them without a word, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he untied the ribbon. He scanned the top letter, his eyes moving quickly over the elegant flowing script that had been her lifeline for months. He grunted, then turned to the return address on the envelope. Gus leaned in, squinting. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That's the address for the old Silver Creek claim. Ain't nobody lived up there for a decade. Place is a known hideout for drifters and, well, fellas who'd rather not be found." He glanced nervously at Silas. "Same area where Kane's gang was spotted last month, Sheriff." Silas's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he looked at Laura not as a nuisance, but as a piece of a puzzle he was just beginning to see. A mail-order bride lured to a town on the very day it was hit by letters sent from an outlaw's den. It couldn't be a coincidence. He saw her, then truly saw her. The quiet fear in her eyes, the worn fabric of her dress, the way she held herself with a stillness that spoke of a life spent trying not to take up space. She wasn't an accomplice. She was a pawn, another victim of Jedediah Kane. The thought soured in his gut. "You were lied to," he said, the words harsher than he intended. He handed the letters back to her. "There is no such man here." Laura's breath hitched. Her hands clutching the letters that were now just paper and ink fell to her sides. She looked small and breakable, a sparrow caught in a blizzard. Am I under arrest, Sheriff?" His voice was flat-tired. Your only crime was believing too easily. He strode to the door and opened it, letting in a blast of frigid air and swirling snow. The sounds of the unsettled town rushed in with it. "You are free to go." She stared at him, stunned, as if the words struck her with more force than a cell door slamming shut. She was free to go where into the storm, into a town of strangers who saw her as nothing more than a fool. With a quiet, defeated dignity, she nodded once, picked up her suitcase, and stepped out into the biting cold. Silas remained in the doorway watching her. A knot of something unfamiliar and unwelcome twisted in his chest. "Let her go. You have enough to deal with. Kane has Elena's locket. That's what matters." He watched her walk, her steps slow and aimless, her boots sinking into the deepening snow. She made it as far as a bench across the street in front of the shuttered mercantile. Then, as if her strength had simply run out, her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto it. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently, her hair already crusted with ice. But she did not cry out. She did not call for help. She simply sat there enduring, as if this was all she had ever known. Silas cursed under his breath, a low guttural sound of self-reproach. He thought of Elena, of her unwavering belief that a man's decency wasn't measured in the fights he won, but in the people he refused to abandon. He was failing that measure. His hand gripped the doorknob until his knuckles were white, A long moment passed, the howling wind, his only counsel. Then with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 4 years of grief, he opened the door again and crossed the street in long, angry strides. He didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one that still faintly smelled of Elena's cedar chest, and laid it over Laura's shaking shoulders. She flinched at the sudden weight and warmth, her head snapping up. Her lips were tinged with blue. "Come back inside," he ordered, his voice gruff to hide the crack in his resolve. Her eyes, wide and confused, searched his. Why, she whispered the word, barely audible. Silas turned his gaze from her, looking out into the swirling white abyss that was swallowing his town. "Because I don't have time to bury another fool who waited in the cold for someone who never came." The general store was a cacophony of anxious voices. 2 days after the robbery, the fear in Frost Hollow had curdled into a simmering anger, and much of it was being directed, albeit indirectly, at the sheriff's office. Laura had ventured out with Silas's daughter Lena, a silent, solemn 6-year-old with her father's haunted eyes. They needed flour and lamp oil, a simple errand that felt like traversing hostile territory. As Laura entered, a bell jangled, and the conversations dropped to hushed whispers. All eyes turned to her, the mysterious woman staying under the sheriff's roof. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, like a physical pressure, and she kept her head low, her hand tight around Lena's. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Altha Whitcomb, a formidable woman, whose corsets seemed to be laced with pure indignation. Her brother-in-law was Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, a fact she had been reminding everyone of since the robbery. When she saw Laura, her thin lips tightened into a razor-thin line. "Well?" Mrs. Whitcomb's voice cut through the store's tense quiet, sharp and carrying. "If it isn't the sheriff's new charity case." Laura froze by a barrel of pickles, her cheeks flushing hot. She tried to ignore the comment, turning her attention to the sacks of flour stacked against the wall. Lena pressed closer to her side. "It's a strange thing," Mrs. Whitcomb continued, loudly polishing an already gleaming countertop. "Our sheriff can't seem to stop a single smiling outlaw from waltzing into the bank and taking whatever he pleases, but he has all the time in the world to take in a stray." A few of the men near the stove chuckled uneasily. The comment landed exactly as intended, a stone aimed at 2 targets. "My family's savings were in that bank," she went on, her voice rising with theatrical grievance. "And Jedediah Kane just strolls out with it, tipping his hat for all I know. Meanwhile, the law is busy playing house." She fixed her sharp, bird-like eyes on Laura. "I have to wonder what sort of woman travels halfway across the country on the word of a ghost, only to end up under the protection of a grieving man. It takes a certain kind of cunning, I imagine." "Please," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "Please stop." Mrs. Whitcomb's smile was venomous. "You don't belong here. You're a reminder of his failure, miss. A distraction he can't afford. Go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of." Tears stung Laura's eyes. She couldn't defend herself without making things worse for Silas. Grabbing Lena's hand, she turned and fled the store, the jangling of the bell mocking her retreat. She didn't stop until she was back in the relative safety of the sheriff's cabin, her heart pounding with a familiar shame. She didn't know how long Silas had been standing in the doorway of the store, but when he stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The door didn't slam. It closed with a soft, ominous click that silenced every whisper. He walked to the counter, his spurs unnaturally loud on the floorboards, and stopped directly in front of Mrs. Whitcomb. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his storm-gray eyes flat and cold as river stones. The store held its breath. Mrs. Whitcomb's face paled, but she held her ground. "Sheriff," she began, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "I was just saying what everyone is thinking. You let Kane get away. What you were doing, Altha Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet, was aiming your fear at a woman who has done nothing to you. The man you have a grievance with is standing right here. His gaze swept the room, pinning every onlooker in place. Jedediah Kane is my business. The safety of this town is my business. Who I allow under my roof is also my business. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. I don't care what letters she received or what story brought her to my door. She is a guest in my home. Her name is Laura. And if I hear anyone in this town, anyone at all, speak it with anything less than respect, they will be speaking against me. He straightened up, his presence filling the room. And I do not take kindly to insults, especially from cowards hiding behind ribbon counters. Do we have an understanding? Mrs. Whitcomb's face was a mottled red. She gave a stiff, jerky nod. Silas held her gaze for another long moment, before turning and walking out the bell, chiming his departure. Later that afternoon, as Laura sat numbly in the kitchen, Silas returned. He didn't mention the incident. He simply placed a paper bag on the table in front of her. Inside was the flour she had wanted, a fresh wick for the lamp, and a small bag of lemon drops, Lena's favorite. Laura looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You defended me. I enforced what's right, he replied gruffly, turning to hang his hat on its peg. You didn't have to. You don't owe me anything. He paused, his back still to her. No, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But I owed it to myself. He finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was raw with a history she didn't yet understand. Because I once stood by and watched this town ignore the pain of someone I loved. I will not let them do it again. Not to you. In the quiet hours of the following days, a fragile domesticity began to settle over the sheriff's cabin. While Silas was out consumed by the hunt for Kane, Laura brought a gentle order to the house. She mended Lena's clothes, coaxed the child into speaking in full sentences, and filled the silence with the soft hum of old lullabies. One afternoon, tasked with organizing the clutter in Silas's office, she found a stack of old case files tied with string. Her intention was simply to dust and stack them neatly on a shelf. But one file, thicker than the others, slipped from the bundle. The cover was worn, the label written in Silas's stark, angular hand. Shootout at Miller's Pass. Ethan Kane, deceased. April 12th, 1881. Her breath caught. Kane. Hesitantly, she opened the file. The official report was dry and procedural, detailing a botched robbery attempt by a young outlaw named Ethan Kane. Sheriff Granger and his then deputy had cornered him. Shots were fired. Ethan Kane was killed. But it was a secondary report, a handwritten addendum by the town doctor, that made her blood run cold. It described the chaos that followed the shootout. Panicked townsfolk, horses rearing in fear. A civilian bystander caught in the melee was knocked down by a bolting carriage horse. The report detailed her injuries: a severe blow to the head, internal trauma. The civilian's name was Elena Granger. The final entry was dated 3 days later. Died from her injuries. Laura sank into the sheriff's chair, her hands trembling. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas's profound, unyielding grief. The hollowness in his eyes, the way he looked at his daughter as if she were a precious, fragile thing he was terrified of breaking. And now, Jedediah Kane. This wasn't about money or outlaw pride. This was about a brother. It was about revenge. That evening, Silas was working late at his desk, poring over maps and telegrams. The stationery was spread out before him, the very letters Laura had received from her phantom fiancé. He'd been quiet and distracted for days, but now there was a new intensity to his focus. The paper, he said suddenly, not looking up. It's high-grade linen stock, not something you find at a general store out here. He tapped a telegram next to the letters. Just got word from the marshal in Denver. A shipment of this exact paper was stolen from a stagecoach 6 months ago. The robbery was attributed to Kane's gang. Laura stood in the doorway, the forgotten case file feeling like a lead weight in her memory. The pieces were connecting, forming a terrible, intricate web with her at its center. She wasn't just a pawn. She was the bait. He planned this. Silas muttered more to himself than to her. Every word. He chose this town for a reason. He finally looked up at her, his eyes dark with a dawning horror. He wanted you here. But why? Before Laura could answer, before she could tell him what she had learned, the front door creaked open. Lena stood there, her small face pale, clutching a single wilting wildflower. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A man gave this to me. He said it was for Mama's garden." Silas was on his feet in an instant. "What man, Lena? Where did you see him?" "By the creek," she said, pointing with a shaky finger. "He was tall. He smiled at me." A cold dread, sharp and absolute, seized Silas. He grabbed his coat and gun belt, his face a mask of stone. "Stay inside, both of you. Lock the door." He was gone before they could reply. Laura bolted the door and knelt beside the terrified child, but her own heart was hammering against her ribs. This was Jedediah Kane's next move, a message sent via his own daughter. The storm was no longer gathering. It had broken directly over their house. Silas found it exactly where he knew it would be. The small cemetery on the hill behind the church was desolate, the wind whistling a mournful tune through the iron crosses and weathered headstones. Snow clung to the inscription on Elena's grave marker, obscuring her name. But something else lay there, placed deliberately in the center of the stone, glinting with a faint silvery light against the encroaching dusk. The locket. He approached the grave slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, that Kane was watching from the darkened pines at the edge of the clearing. He didn't care. He knelt, his bare hand brushing the snow from the locket. It was cold, so cold, but as his fingers closed around it, a phantom warmth seemed to emanate from the metal, a ghost of the woman who had worn it. He clicked it open. Elena's miniature portrait stared up at him, her smile a silent accusation. On the other side, where a lock of Lena's baby hair had once been, was a single pressed wildflower, the same kind Lena had been given. The rage returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hot, blind fury of the robbery. It was a cold, focused certainty. Kane was not just taunting him. He was desecrating a memory, twisting the most sacred parts of Silas's life into weapons to be used against him. He stormed back to the cabin, the locket clutched in his fist. He burst through the door, his face a thundercloud. Laura and Lena looked up from the floor where they were playing with wooden blocks, their faces etched with fear. He was here. Silas growled, his voice a low tremor of contained violence. He threw the locket onto the table. It spun with a metallic skittering sound before coming to rest. Laura gasped, recognizing it from his description of the robbery. He rounded on her, his control finally snapping. "Tell me everything. Every word in those letters you remember, every turn of phrase. What did he promise you? What did he say about this town, about me?" Laura flinched back, her eyes wide with hurt and fear. I don't know. He wrote of peace, of starting a new life." "Lies." Silas roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the locket jump. Lena let out a small cry and hid behind Laura's skirts. The sound broke through his rage, and he visibly recoiled, shame warring with his fury. He ran a hand over his face, his breathing ragged. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice dropping. I need to understand." Laura took a shaky breath, her mind racing, trying to grasp for anything, any detail that might matter. She thought of the elegant script, the poetic words that had seemed so sincere. He wrote that Frost Hollow was a place where old debts are settled and justice is finally served. Silas froze. The phrase hung in the air between them, charged with a new sinister meaning. And then Laura remembered the file. The shootout. The dead brother. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the case file. About Ethan Kane. There was a note you wrote in the margin. You quoted the judge at the inquest. He called Miller's Pass the place where justice was served." The realization struck them both at the same time, a silent, sickening thunderclap. It wasn't just about Elena's death in the aftermath. It was about his brothers. Jedediah Kane didn't just blame Silas for the loss of his family. He saw Silas as a perversion of the very idea of justice. My God. Silas breathed, sinking into a chair. He looked at Laura, then at his daughter, and the full, monstrous scope of Kane's plan became clear. It wasn't a random scam. It wasn't just about luring you here. He looked at Laura, his eyes filled with a terrifying clarity. He brought you here for me. He wanted to see me build something again. He wanted me to have a family. His voice broke, the final horrifying piece clicking into place. Only so he could be the one to tear it all away. The next day, the fragile peace was shattered for good. Laura had walked Lena to the small one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, a routine that had become a small point of light in their tense existence. She watched as Lena joined the other children, her solemn face breaking into a rare, fleeting smile, as her friend offered her a piece of chalk. Reassured, Laura turned towards the general store, her mind still reeling from the previous night's revelation. She was gone for less than an hour. When she returned to the schoolhouse at midday, the yard was empty. The other children were already on their way home for lunch. But Lena was not on the porch steps, where she always waited. A knot of ice formed in Laura's stomach. She pushed open the door. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Albright, was wiping down the blackboard, her back to the door. "Miss Albright," Laura asked, her voice tight, "is Lena still here?" The teacher turned a frown on her face. "Why, no. I thought she'd gone with her father. He came for her a short while ago." The ice in Laura's stomach spread through her entire body. Her father, Sheriff Granger. "Well, I didn't see him clearly," Miss Albright admitted, flustered. A tall man in a duster was waiting by the creek. Lena ran right to him, calling Daddy. He said the sheriff had sent him that there was an emergency, and he was to bring her home straight away. He seemed to know her, and she certainly seemed to know him. Laura didn't hear the rest. She was already running, her skirts catching on brambles, her lungs burning with the cold air and sheer terror. The smiling man by the creek. It was him. It was Kane. She burst into the sheriff's office, gasping for breath. "Silas, it's Lena. He has her." Silas was on his feet before she finished the sentence, his face draining of all color. He met her at the door of the cabin. Moments later, his expression a terrifying calm. Tacked to the center of the wooden door was a folded piece of paper, held in place by a hunting knife. He pulled the knife free and unfolded the note. The script was the same elegant flowing hand as the letters. Granger. A father's love is a powerful thing. Let's see how powerful. The old saloon at the abandoned Silver Creek claim. Midnight. Come alone. If I see a single deputy, you will never see your daughter again. We have a debt to settle, you and I. Justice is waiting. The ultimatum was absolute. It was the ultimate personal attack, forcing him to choose between his duty as a lawman, which demanded strategy and backup, and his role as a father, which screamed for him to do whatever the monster demanded. "I'm going alone," Silas said, his voice flat and dead. He began checking his revolver, his movements mechanical. "No." He looked up, surprised by the steel in Laura's voice. She stood before him, her fear-widened eyes burning with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The passive victim who had stepped off the train was gone, burned away by the crisis. "You can't," she insisted. "This is what he wants. It's a trap, Silas. Not just for you, but for your soul. He wants to turn you into him, a man motivated by nothing but revenge." "He has my daughter," Silas roared, his composure cracking. "I know," she countered, stepping closer. "Which is why you cannot go in there blind. I know how he thinks. I spent months reading his words, living inside his lies. He's a manipulator, not just a gunman. He'll use Lena to get into your head. He'll use Elena. You need a plan. We need a plan." He stared at her, seeing for the first time not a woman he needed to protect, but a partner. She was right. His grief and rage made him predictable. Kane was counting on that. Laura, with her quiet observations and intimate knowledge of Kane's manipulative prose, was the one thing the outlaw hadn't counted on. He slowly lowered the gun. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, and in that moment they ceased to be a sheriff and a ward. They were a team united against the coming darkness. The storm returned with the night, a furious blizzard that seemed intent on wiping Frost Hollow from the map. Wind screamed through the broken boards of the derelict saloon at the Silver Creek Claim, driving curtains of snow through the empty window frames. The only light inside came from a single battered lantern placed on the bar, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. The air was thick with the smell of decay, wet wood, and the bitter cold. Silas pushed through the swinging doors, which groaned on their rusted hinges. He was alone, just as the note demanded. His hand hovered over the butt of his Colt, his senses on high alert. And then he saw them. At the far end of the room, sitting at a dusty poker table, was Jedediah Kane. Lena was on his lap. He wasn't holding a gun to her head or tying her to the chair. He was holding her small hand, his head bent close to hers, and he was calmly telling her a story. And so the brave knight rode into the dragon's lair. Kane's rich baritone filled the cavernous room, not to slay the beast, but to ask why it was so angry. Lena, seemingly mesmerized, looked up as Silas entered. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but not frightened. "Hello," Sheriff Kane said, looking up. His smile was calm, almost welcoming. He had removed his bandana, and his face was handsome, intelligent, marked by lines of both laughter and sorrow. "Right on time. Please join us. We were just getting to the interesting part." This was the trap. Not an ambush of guns, but an assault on the mind. Silas walked slowly forward, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards. He stopped at the opposite side of the table. "Let her go, Kane." "All in good time," Jedediah said smoothly. He stroked Lena's hair. "She's a wonderful child, Sheriff. So trusting. Reminds me of my brother Ethan. He trusted people too. Trusted the law. Trusted that a man's hard work would be honored." Silas's hand tightened on his gun belt. "Your brother was a thief. He died resisting arrest." Kane's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew cold. "Is that the story you tell yourself? The neat, simple version that lets you sleep at night?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Here's another story, Sheriff. A true one. My brother was a homesteader. He and a dozen other families poured their life savings into a plot of land sold to them by a very respectable land baron from Denver, a man named Marcus Thorne, a man who, it turned out, never owned the land to begin with. It was a scam. Thorne stole everything from them. Silas stood rigid, the wind howling around them. Ethan wasn't robbing a payroll when you cornered him. Cain continued, his voice laced with a quiet, burning intensity. He was trying to get his money back. Their money. He rode into town to confront Thorne's agent to demand what was rightfully his. You and your deputy saw a robbery in progress. You saw a young man with a gun and a desperate look in his eye, and you acted as judge, jury, and executioner. You didn't ask why. You just enforced your black and white version of the law. The words hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the desperation in the young man's eyes. He had dismissed it as the fear of a cornered criminal. What if it had been the righteous anger of a cheated man? Your justice that day created me, Granger, Cain said softly. It took an idealistic boy's life and left a ghost in its place. And the chaos you unleashed, it took your wife too. We both lost family that day because you were too blind to see the truth. So I decided to open your eyes. I brought Miss Laura here, a woman full of hope, to show you what a new beginning feels like. I wanted you to feel it, really feel it, right before I burned it to the ground. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the saloon. A stack of empty barrels toppled over, shattering the tense silence. Cain spun around, his hand instinctively flying to his Schofield. Lena took the opportunity to scramble off his lap and run towards her father. Daddy. Silas scooped her up, his heart pounding. It was the diversion. Laura. She had circled around the back just as they'd planned. Cain recovered instantly, his revolver leveled at Silas. A touching reunion. But it ends here. This was the moment of choice. The old Silas, the man fueled by 4 years of grief and rage, would have fired. He would have killed Jedediah Cain in vengeance for Elena, for Lena, for everything. But as he looked at Cain's face, he no longer saw a monster. He saw a man twisted by the same grief that had nearly consumed him. He saw a mirror. Killing him would not be justice. It would only be perpetuating the cycle. Instead of drawing his gun, Silas shoved Lena behind him. It's over, Cain. Cain laughed, a broken, desperate sound. It's not over until my brother's name is cleared. He fired. But Silas was already moving, diving to the side, not to shoot, but to create an angle. He fired his own Colt, once the shot precise, aimed not at Cain's heart, but at his shoulder. The Schofield clattered to the floor. Cain cried out, stumbling back against the bar, clutching his arm. Silas was on him in a second, kicking the gun away, his face inches from Cain's. You'll get your justice. Silas said, his voice low and steady, free of hatred for the first time in years. You're going to stand trial? You're going to tell everyone about Marcus Thorne, and my testimony will back you up. He was not killing a man in revenge. He was arresting him, finally breaking his own cycle of grief-fueled violence, and choosing to believe in the very justice he had once blindly and tragically misserved. In the days that followed Jedediah Cain's capture, a different kind of storm broke over Frost Hollow, one of truth. Cain's testimony, backed by Silas's own investigation, and a formal report to the territorial marshal, was irrefutable. The land baron Marcus Thorne was exposed, his empire of corruption dismantled. The story of Ethan Cain, the wronged homesteader, became a cautionary tale whispered throughout the territory. Jedediah was sentenced to prison, but his brother's name was cleared. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had finally been served. The town looked at Sheriff Granger differently now. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He was no longer the town's grim shadow, but its protector, a man who had faced his own demons in a derelict saloon and chosen mercy over vengeance. The change was most palpable inside the small cabin at the edge of town. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the murmur of conversation and, occasionally, the sound of Lena's laughter, clear and bright as a spring morning. One evening, as Laura stitched a patch onto Lena's dress, Silas sat across from her polishing the silver locket. He had cleaned it meticulously, restoring its shine. "I used to think that holding on to the pain was the only way to honor her memory," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the locket. He looked up at Laura, his eyes clear. "I was wrong. Elena wouldn't have wanted a life lived in shadow. She would have wanted Lena to hear stories about her, to know her by the joy she brought, not the silence she left behind." He talked then for the first time about his wife, about her terrible singing voice, her love for the scent of pine after a rain, the way she could coax a smile from the grumpiest old rancher. He spoke not with the sharp agony of loss, but with the gentle warmth of fond remembrance. As the last of the snow melted, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath, the world seemed to be waking from a long slumber. The air filled with the smell of wet soil and new beginnings. The constant dripping of icicles from the eaves became a soft, percussive rhythm, marking the end of the long winter. One afternoon, Silas returned from his patrol and found Laura and Lena in the small yard behind the cabin, clearing a patch of ground. Lena pointed to the first tiny green shoots of crocuses pushing their way through the mud. The sight of them, so fragile and yet so determined, filled Silas with a hope so potent it almost hurt. The long frost that had encased his heart was finally irrevocably thawing. Months later, the full bloom of spring had transformed Frost Hollow. The stark, skeletal trees were now cloaked in green, and the air hummed with the buzz of life. The town's founding day picnic was in full swing, the square filled with checkered blankets, the smell of fresh-baked pies, and the cheerful sounds of a fiddle. Silas, Laura, and Lena sat together on a quilt near the old oak tree, slightly apart from the main crowd. It was not a public spectacle, but a quiet family moment. Lena, her hair braided with wildflowers, chased butterflies, while Silas and Laura watched a comfortable silence settled between them. Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it in Laura's hand. She unwrapped it to reveal a small, exquisitely hand-carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched, painted a delicate, vibrant blue. "A bluebird," she whispered, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. Elena always said seeing the first bluebird of the season meant the winter was truly over. Silas said, his voice soft. "She always wanted to see one. I thought it was time. It wasn't a ring or a grand declaration, but it was more. It was a promise not of replacing a memory, but of building a new one alongside it. It was a promise of spring." As they sat together, watching Lena, the mail coach clattered into town, its arrival announced by the driver's horn. The postmaster sorted through the bags, then made his way through the picnic crowd, handing out letters. He stopped at their blanket, a hint of a respectful smile on his face. "Afternoon, Sheriff. Miss Laura." He handed her a single crisp envelope. Laura stared at it. The postmark was from Missouri. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The handwriting was her mother's, tight and unfamiliar after so many years. She read the letter, her eyes growing wide. A traveling merchant had passed through her hometown carrying tales from Colorado. Stories of a brave woman who had faced down outlaws and gossip to build a new life with the sheriff of Frost Hollow and his daughter. Her family, shamed by their previous coldness and impressed by her strength, was writing to apologize. They asked for forgiveness for a chance to reconnect. They wanted her to know she had a home to come back to. Quiet tears slipped down Laura's cheeks as she read. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She had a family waiting for her back home, an open door she had once longed for more than anything. But as she looked at Silas, his warm gaze upon her, and at Lena, who ran back and threw her arms around her neck, she knew she was already home. The family she belonged to was not one of blood or obligation, but one forged in the crucible of a harsh winter, built on courage, forgiveness, and choice. Together, the three of them watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. A perfect end to a perfect spring day.